Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking a shortcut into a feeling that, well, I think most of us have felt, but very few of us have ever been able to name properly. We're looking at some excerpts on a concept called gestalt failure, when the field collapses. And our mission today really is to give you some precise structural language for a very specific kind of deep exhaustion. This isn't your normal everyday stress. This is a profound, almost necessary kind of withdrawal that the usual words, burnout, trauma, they just don't seem to fit. We want to find the actual structural flaw that leads to the collapse.
And that language is so critical because, as the source material points out right away, almost everyone recognizes the feeling. That sense of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix, or that urgent need to pull back that doesn't feel like you're just avoiding things. But because we don't have the right words, we use those other labels, and then we end up misdiagnosing the whole problem.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the first impulse, our societal default, is to frame this psychologically, right? If you feel that level of breakdown, well, you must be burned out, or you're traumatized, or you're just, personally feeling to cope. We turn it inward. But the author of this source material just rejects that idea completely. They state flat out, that framing has never fit my experience.
That's such a powerful statement, isn't it? It basically suggests we've been asking the wrong question the whole time. If someone is saying, I'm shutting down, and telling me to meditate is doing nothing, they're not saying they're bad at coping. They're telling you the problem isn't where you think it is.
Exactly. I still struggle a bit with separating the psychological from the structural, though. I mean, if you're exhausted, isn't that an emotion? A psychological state? Why does that label fall so short?
Well, because trying to fix a structural collapse with a psychological tool it's just guaranteed to fail. Think about it like this. Your house is on fire because the wiring is bad. Burnout theory tells you to go inside the burning house and practice deep breathing.
Right. It's completely missing the point.
Completely. The source is arguing that this isn't stress or overwhelm in that narrow sense. It's not enough to look inside for the flaw when the problem is actually external.
So if the issue isn't the person's own stress capacity, where do the sources say the failure actually is?
What's fascinating here is how quickly they pivot from the personal to the environmental. The source defines the real cause as something more structural, the collapse of a relational field. It moves the problem. It's not that your internal engine has broken down from overuse. It's that the entire environment you need to operate in has just vanished.
That phrase, relational field, sounds a little abstract. What does that actually mean in this context? Why is its collapse so catastrophic?
The relational field is basically the whole atmosphere. It's the context, the coherence, the unspoken rules that let you engage with something authentically. It's the space where meaning can actually land safely. But here's the really critical piece. This collapse is especially devastating for a certain type of mind, the gestalt-oriented mind. If your brain isn't wired that way, the field could get worse, and it's bad, but it might not cause a total shutdown. For the gestalt mind, though, its entire operating system depends on it.
And this brings us right to a core idea in the material, which is getting a really clear definition of what gestalt processing actually is, because it sounds like a term that gets misused a lot.
Oh, absolutely. The source spends a good amount of time on this. It points out that gestalt processing often gets reduced to just being about language, learning in whole chunks instead of single words. Or, as the source says, it's folded prematurely into autism discourse, where it is either medicalized or misunderstood.
So it gets simplified.
Exactly. It makes it easier to just put a label on the person, but it totally obscures what they actually need cognitively to function.
So let's get that distinction clear for everyone listening. If it's not just a language style, what is the precise definition the source is using?
The source gives a definition that's, I think, really profound. It says that gestalt processing isn't just about how you express meaning. Fundamentally, it is about how meaning lands. It's your entire intake system. And its one core requirement is totality, wholeness.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me, because my brain definitely defaults to linear, step-by-step logic. For these gestalt-oriented minds, the source says, and this is a quote, coherence is not optional. It's an absolute must-have. If you take that away, the ability to process anything just stops.
To make that concrete, think about the difference between building a jigsaw puzzle and recognizing a face.
Okay.
Linear thinking is the puzzle. You take piece A, you connect it to piece B, then C, and slowly the picture emerges. If you're missing a few pieces, it's annoying, but you can still basically see the image. The meaning is built up piece by piece.
Right, and the gestalt mind.
That's recognizing a face. The meaning arrives all at once, whole, through context, tone, pattern, and relation. Now, if that face is suddenly distorted, or the tone of voice doesn't match the expression, the image doesn't just get a little harder to see, it becomes meaningless noise.
It's not picture anymore.
Exactly. If you strip away the coherence, the consistency of the face and its context, the whole machine just stops.
Right.
Because the input it needs to run is gone. The meaning has to arrive whole, or it just doesn't arrive.
That's a great analogy. It really shifts coherence from being a nice-to-have to being a critical piece of operating equipment. So if coherence is non-negotiable, that must mean the individual is constantly, scanning their environment to make sure that face is still consistent.
Precisely. The source describes this as a core function. Gestalt-oriented people locate themselves by sensing the field. It's not about analyzing data points one by one. It's like using a full-body sensor array to check the integrity of the whole system.
What are they sensing for in that field? What tells them it has integrity?
They're sensing these very specific, often very subtle things. The source says they're taking in what is present, what is missing, what is being held, and what is being quietly ignored. The health of the field is all about the consistency between those things.
Right.
So, for example, if a company's stated value is radical transparency, but crucial information is constantly being quietly ignored, swept under the rug, that field becomes incoherent.
Oh, I can picture that in 1,000 different meetings. The meeting where everyone knows what the real toxic issue is, but the agenda is all about some tiny superficial thing. That gap must feel excruciating for a Gestalt mind.
It is. Because their mind registers the entire context. It feels the dissonance between what's present, the trivial agenda, and what's missing, any real honesty, and what's being quietly ignored, the giant elephant in the room. And, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source is clear that when the field is working, the result is extraordinary. When it's coherent, these minds function with extraordinary depth and responsiveness. They are incredibly insightful.
But when that coherence starts to break apart, that same attunement becomes a huge liability because they feel the disintegration so much more sharply than a linear processor might.
Absolutely. Their whole system is built to detect and integrate patterns. So when the patterns become contradictory or unstable, when the rules keep changing, when accountability vanishes, when there's gaslighting, the mind just can't build a coherent picture. It burns all of its energy trying to make sense of the nonsensical.
And that is what ultimately leads to the shutdown, the Gestalt failure. The exhaustion isn't just being tired, it's the physical result of the system trying to run an impossible program.
That is exactly why the symptoms are so specific. It's an exhaustion that rest doesn't fix, because rest isn't fixing the external threat to coherence. It's a withdrawal that doesn't feel like avoidance, because you're pulling away from a toxic system, not from connection itself. And finally, it's leaving that feels less like a choice and more like a deep necessity. The source says this withdrawal is felt internally as an act of survival.
So the big aha moment for you, listening, is really seeing the difference between two completely different types of failure. The traditional view says the failure is personal, you failed to cope, and that's burnout. But this structural view says the system failed. The environment failed to provide the coherence that this kind of mind needs to operate. It just shifts the whole conversation away from blame.
It does, and once you reframe it like that, the solutions change completely. If the problem is structural, the solution can't just be self-care. It has to be changing the structure or removing yourself from it.
Which leads to the big implication in the source material. What do you do when you realize the environment you're in is just incapable of providing that relational field anymore?
And this raises an important question. What happens when that field collapses and you, as someone who needs coherence to survive, are left? The material implies that a sort of placeholder system takes over, and that is, compliance often replaces relation.
Okay, let's break that down. Compliance replaces relation. That sounds like the mind is being forced to run on a totally foreign operating system.
It is. Relation is about fluidity, context, coherence. Compliance is rigid. It's rule-based. It's disconnected from any real meaning. So when you're forced to give up on genuine relational coherence, where what's said and what's done actually line up, and instead you just have to follow rigid rules because the environment is too broken to trust, that's fundamentally unsustainable for a mind that needs to see the whole picture.
You're forced to act in a linear, rigid way, even if the rules themselves don't make sense. The cognitive load must be massive.
It is. So when compliance is the only way you can interact anymore, the only possible outcome if you stay is a total shutdown. So you have to leave.
And that's the ultimate necessity. The source calls this ethical leaving.
Yes. That's the term it uses.
I want to push on that term a little. Ethical leaving, is that just a fancy way of saying you're quitting? How is the source defining this as a necessity and not just a preference?
I think it's called ethical because it carries this moral weight. It's necessary. If staying in that broken field means you have to betray your own core cognitive process, if it means forcing yourself to operate in a way that is profoundly incoherent and, frankly, self-destructive, then leaving is the only way to preserve your own integrity, your own survival.
So it's not about finding a better job, it's about escaping a situation that's actively making coherent thought impossible.
Exactly. It's ethical because staying would mean violating the very integrity you need to live a good life. It becomes a moral imperative.
That definition is just so validating. It reframes that intense need to withdraw. It's not a personal failing. It's a necessary act of survival in the face of a failing structure. So what does this all mean? The key insight, I think, from this deep dive is getting this precise definition of gestalt failure. It's that necessary withdrawal that has to happen when the relational field, the very source of coherence and meaning, is just gone. When that field disappears, compliance replaces relation, and for the Gestalt mind, the only path forward is to get out.
And that brings us to a final, maybe provocative thought for you to take away from this, building on that idea of ethical leaving. If this departure is a structural necessity and it's driven by the collapse of that field, especially by those things that are being quietly ignored, then think about the environments that you're in. What might ethical leaving look like in your own professional or even social spaces? Reflect on any situations where you know critical information is there, but the group is deliberately not holding it. That's where the incoherence begins. Because once you can name the structural failure, you can stop blaming yourself for the stress of it, and you can start to identify what conditions you actually need to survive.